has become increasingly important for companies to measure their carbon footprint. Now, what do we mean by carbon footprint? Well, we simply mean a measure of the level of carbon emission by the company, and this measure of carbon emission is typically normalized, either by, depending on the companies, either by the value of the company for listed companies, or by the revenues of the company, or perhaps by the number of students if we are not looking at the company, but we are looking at measuring the carbon footprint of an academic institution. And yes, in case you wonder, we do measure the carbon footprint of EDHEC Business School. Well, clearly measuring the carbon footprint of a given activity is the first step towards reducing the carbon footprint, right? Obviously, you cannot manage what you can't measure. So we need to measure first, then, to know if we can reduce this carbon emission that is required by the energy transition. Now, it may sound pretty simple to measure carbon emission from a company or from an institution, but it is not as simple as it may sound. There are actually 3 different scopes, and these different scopes vary in terms of ambition, in terms of how much coverage we want to have. Scope 1 is just a direct measure of carbon emission by an activity. Scope 2 is a measure that also includes carbon emission from the energy sources that are being consumed and used by the activity. And Scope 3, which is the most comprehensive, also includes carbon emission downwards and upwards the value chain. In other words, the suppliers and also the consumers are also included. So how much a given line of business has in terms of carbon impact also includes, or should also include, consumption, emission by suppliers, transportation of those goods and services, consumers of those goods and services as well. The distinction between Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 actually happens to be very important for some sectors in particular. When you look at the financials, financial companies and also telecommunication companies, these companies do not tend to have a big carbon footprint if we only look at the Scope 1 measure. In other words, the amount of greenhouse gas emission that they directly emit. But if we start looking beyond the mere emission by their activities and we look at the entire value chain, then we find that the level of emission can be substantially higher.